everybody. I'm pleased to. This is sort of a reunion for me to get back together with Ray because the first time that I met Ray was a conference that I was putting on for the very first time. It was called the Agile Management Conference. Was doing it in Seattle, and I needed a keynote speaker desperately. So I called my friends and I was like, "Who'd be really, really good?" And they said, well, there's this guy, Ray, and he's this leader over at Intel who's leading the charge on the agile transformation there, and he might be really good. And so I called Ray up and I did a little looking, and I found out that Ray had, well, he was really big into modeling. And I was like, oh my God, this is a guy who's like my soulmate here. He had his own giant Dalek in one side, in his office. He had this amazingly detailed Starship Enterprise. And I talked to Ray and learned that he really did have a wonderful way of conveying his understanding of how businesses approach agility. And so I had him for the conference, and he was fabulous. He knocked it out of the park. He did, I mean, he just made the conference for me. And so it was with that I got to know Ray, and his path after that went towards things like, well, he was doing independent consulting with his company nuAgility. He also was a leader for the Agile Alliance, where he was the chief of innovation. You get the best titles, Ray. I gotta figure out how you get some of those titles. Chief of Innovation, Director of Emerging Systems and Transformation. Man, you're good at titles. So with that, I'd like to introduce Ray Arell. And Ray, what did I miss? I probably there's a whole lot in there that probably could be improved on.
I think you hit most of the high points. Just one thing to note with Intel, I was there for 3 decades. So I've had a variety of different careers inside of the company. Started off as an engineer for about half of it. And then the second half, you wake up one day and they say, hey, you should go into leadership and management, which I think that was probably not the wisest move, but I did it anyway. And so went into leadership and was doing anything from a variety of different projects, including microprocessors and platform design and other work. And then eventually, towards the latter part of my Intel career, I was running the Agile transformation that was going across 162 sites worldwide. We had a community of practice of about 52,000 people that were practicing Agile in some way, shape, or form. So I've converted from a waterfall dude to over to the Agile side, and I've been that for some time.
Very cool. Thank you, Ray. So I'm here with a few questions about strategy. That's largely our theme today. And as we're going through this, Ray's probably going to fire a few back at me. And you know what? You guys may have some questions of your own. So please don't hesitate to put those into the chat. And if we can, we'll incorporate those here. I'm very casual and laid back, so if this stuff comes up, I'm happy to incorporate it. And please contribute wherever you feel the need. We can kind of treat this rather informally. And with that, I guess maybe I'll start with a confession, which is my impression of strategy is that it is something that takes place when the executives go off to a mountaintop somewhere, some sort of James Bond lair, and they all drink very, very expensive drinks, and they do this thing called strategy. And it happens on this mountaintop, and they're all sipping ambrosia, and they work their way through it, and then it comes down from the mountaintop and is handed to us in the masses. And that's the way I see it, frankly, take place a lot of the time. What's been your impression, Ray, of strategy? And is there a way we can democratize this, that we can bring it down off the mountaintop, that we can maybe have a little bit less ambrosia sipping and a little bit more conversation? Um, what are your thoughts?
Well, when you pictured that, I pictured Mel Brooks coming off the mountain as Moses. I've got these 15 break. these 10 commandments. So I think it depends on the company. I was fortunate enough, if you look at the way that Intel, and I'll again, if I use the word Intel too much, it's just that's not, I cut most of my life through there. The other thing is just a real disclaimer. The views expressed are those of myself and not of my former employer. I'm a retiree and an alumni and a shareholder. So the stuff I'm sharing is public information that I'm giving out. So if there's an Intel lawyer on here, which sometimes follows me around, hey, good to see you again. But we were lucky enough that we practiced what was known as a strategic long range planning session, and even from my early days as an engineer to when I got into leadership, first line management, or as I ascended up into directorship and others, we were at least good enough to understand that since we were a technology based company, that we needed the insights of the people doing the work in order to go establish what that strategy is. Is it business viable? And I remember that word being thrown around a lot. And so from at least my case in the 3 decades I was there, I participated every year in a strategic long range planning session in some shape or form, either providing data or basically taking some, maybe even some prototyping or other early work in order to be able to establish it. I think the on high issue, I think is, and this is true with a lot of companies, and even in the case of companies like Intel, I think the issue of strategy is that we're setting some vision out that's multiple years in size and complexity and it's basically a bet. We're going to start betting resources and people and start to go do big things. In the case of Intel, it would be like build a fab. Billions of dollars would be going and investing by putting a new facility someplace, or to invest in a marketplace some direction. I think the biggest issue is that the feedback cycles coming back from as things are being put down, how is that adapting in real time? What's the time to information in the organization in order for us to be able to react to maybe it was a wrong move, it was a wrong bet? And I think a lot of companies today suffer on that component, definitely. A lot of agile organizations still suffer from that because a lot of them don't talk to the customers as often as they should. And then definitely the tactical side of the business and the strategic side of the business has some weak links in between the two of them, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And when we're talking about this strategy, is this, and I again recognizing that this is Intel back in the day, or
Yeah,
large organizations, um, the mechanisms that we're using at this level, um, to try and get feedback and things like that. Are we talking about classic agile mechanisms, or are we talking about maybe even pre-agile,
mhm,
or I mean, what kinds of tools are we talking about? What were you using at the time? Was it
sure.
SWOT diagrams? How did you try and get feedback and do this thing?
Well, I was fortunate enough to grow up in a company that the father of OKRs lived and breathed. So if you think of Intel, which we used to call them MBOs, management by objective, but basically it's OKRs, that was the mechanism that Andy put in place for the organization to stay in sync. And so if you think of from the highest level of a strategic goal that was set, you could literally trace that through the organization down to, at the time when I joined, I was employee number 32,000 or something like that. You literally could track my management by objective, my OKRs basically linked up to my managers, and that linked up to the director, and that linked up to the division, and that linked up eventually up into Andy's office. And so you could trace a straight line through. And I remember at times, since I started my career in California, Andy used to wander the hallways, or he would sit down with you and have lunch with a group of people, just kind of off the cuff. You'd think he would be over there with the execs, but no, he really liked to integrate with the people. And he would ask the question, says, what is your OKR? What is your key results for this quarter? And you would say them, and he would go, oh, and that's connected to this, and that's going to do this in the business strategy. Very well understood mechanism for us to be able to communicate. There was also another component to it, which I'm not sure if the modern people who are teaching it today understood, is you were never expected to complete all of your key results.
Right.
They were never supposed to be at 100%. We were, in order to take risk, we had to assume that we're going to try very hard things. And therefore we might get to the 90% mark or 50% mark.
So that goes back to your sort of placing bets kind of metaphor here. If our strategy is a bet, if it's a gamble, if it's putting money on a wager, and then our goal setting cannot be things that we automatically just expect to achieve.
Right.
Mm.
And I think that, oh, please.
Take it
Is
out.
that a question?
Which thing?
Somebody's just not
Got
there.
one.
They need to go on mute.
There-
But I think that the one key thing that, as you talked about on high, I think earlier, I
Yeah.
think one of the things that was very interesting about at least the dynamics of the founders of the company was Andy Grove taught my Welcome to Intel class. And he talked about the culture of the organization and how it worked and operated. And Gordon Moore taught the IMBO class. And so it was the culture of the company to teach. Leaders needed to teach, leaders needed to stay connected. Now, over the years, that of course shifted as Paul Udalini and others took up the reins and the founders left. Some of those systems, and then the size of the organization had gotten incredibly large over a very quick period of time. It was hard to actually maintain some of that culture just because of the sheer size of the organization.
Right. That would be hard. So another thing that's occurred to me when I look at strategy is, can you really separate the process you use for your strategy, whatever that might be, whatever tools you're using, whatever methods you're using, from the goal setting or from the way in which you cascade goals down through the organization? Can we think of those things as independent things, or are they tied together?
So you're talking about, like, if we go off and create a SWOT analysis or create any of the tools that we use for this, I think the most important component in all of that is the conversation.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. You could take 3 teams and say, go do a SWOT analysis on X, Y, and you're going to potentially get 3 different perspectives.
Yeah.
And it's important for those conversations to take place. One, the building of the model, I think, opens up the knowledge, of course, of what are the known knowns that we have and the known unknowns, and what are the risk factors associated to it. But if you take it all the dimensions, and I'll use it as an example, does everyone here like Wi-Fi on their laptops? Yeah, you're welcome. This is Centrino technology. When it was being introduced, if you think from a strategy perspective, it wasn't just go put Wi-Fi on the motherboard. There was a much larger issue that existed, which is nobody knew what Wi-Fi was. What was its benefits? Do I think that I need it? Those types of things, if you think of market building and ecosystem growth. So it became the strategies as each of those models were being built out. It was the aha moments of going, oh, you know what? There is no infrastructure out there. How could we suddenly start to influence a marketplace if we don't have Wi-Fi hotspots established at coffee shops? So then partnerships then had to be created in order to go establish ecosystem growth, or shifting around how do we make it so that people took the Centrino brand and related that directly to, oh, that has connectivity on it, and that's going to be my laptop that will get me any place and anywhere. And again, I think what happened when we created any of those models, it just started to peel back the layers of what we needed to go do, and the strategy and how long it was going to take. Yeah, that kept edging out,
Mm-hmm.
but we at least had more knowledge of what we didn't know and what we needed to go explore.
Mm-hmm. So I guess one of the things that distinguishes the agile approach to strategy as opposed to maybe more conventional approaches is that it's that collaborative nature. It's that bringing folks together and talking about stuff. Because I certainly have seen plenty of examples of organizations where, yes, strategy was discussed up top, and then each leader took it back to their independent silo and cascaded it straight down that silo and never talked with any of the other silos when they did that. And so you ended up with a strategy that basically was individually interpreted silo by silo by silo and led to not a whole lot, to be honest with you. And
Mm-hmm.
that seems to be kind of the conventional approach. And so I love one of the things that's been both attractive and terrifying about the agile approach is that we need to find ways to have those conversations, like you were saying, with those three different teams that might be in different areas. How do we bring them together to solve? Well, I mean, the challenge you were describing was audacious. I mean, that was big. So lots of unknowns, lots of uncertainty, which really is super cool.
Well, I think the other thing is just everyone being in sync with what the problem statement is. What are we trying to solve? What's that going to eventually do for our customers?
Yeah.
I'll use another example, USB. Before USB was there, and I'm looking at some of the devices you have in the background there. There's probably a parallel port on there. There's probably a serial port on that old thing. And we
Hmm.
used to have this thing called Plugfest, where we literally brought in all of the OEM customers and we were plugging in all the peripherals to make sure that they worked.
That's
And
awesome.
it was like, this sucks. It's like, why are we putting in so much work to this? And when the USB standard was starting to be created, we knew the opportunity. We
Hmm.
can have one plug to rule them all.
Right.
And I was at an airport in Japan several years back, and I noticed something, and it kind of hit me that I never thought that this was a usage model that we ever thought of. That the power plugs were all USB. That we never really consciously, when USB 1 was being introduced, we were just handling the plug fest issue.
Hmm.
Can we have one plug to plug into everything? But then I'm looking at this project that I used to be on, and it's now become the universal way that you get power to your device, which I
Right.
never really considered that before. So the growth of a long, if you look at an S curve, if you think about, our strategy is to continuously, hopefully be on the rise of that S, but eventually we're going to get into that sort of plateau, and then we're going to start coming down that back end, and maybe it'll end in a long tail. Hopefully it won't shark fin on us and then collapse. But just noticing as some of these standards were rolling out, that we would see the next bump,
Yeah.
the next increase of market penetration, which was pretty amazing to see. Um, I mean, Intel in some regards, and like some big companies, were a little bit like Seinfeld and Kramer. Kramer would fall over backwards and fall into money. If you think about when we got the IBM PC, it was a little bit like that.
Mhm.
Literally, Paul, when he was talking about, the early days of the company before I was even there, they were astonished at the fact that they ended up with the IBM contract. They didn't have enough capacity to do that contract back then, and they've all talked about that. But then again, those inflections, those problem statements, turned into strategic plans that in fact eventually delivered. One other thing to note, I think this is kind of interesting because we're seeing this with companies with big projects, like, if we look at ChatGPT or some of the other things where now the models are big software, that they're running into the same problems that we had with semiconductor manufacturing, which is it takes us 5 years to go build a fab, 10 years in certain cases now. We're seeing like models to go build, say, the next version of AI. It's billions of dollars of investments. And it's years. Next model may be out in 3-5 years, depending on the work that's involved with it. So some of the strategic planning that's there also has to go look at these kind of market trends and say, okay, well, how do we fund the next thing? How do we start to get enough dollars coming in from some of our legacy stuff in order to go bridge us through the period of time? So some of it is also looking at that aspect of how can we bring things back to Genesis? How can we just do a slight tweak to it in order for it to continue to help fund the work that we're trying to do?
Yeah, yeah. And I guess sort of a related challenge here is as you're trying to do that, not only are you trying to get the funding to do all of that, but getting everyone into alignment on that stuff has got to be a challenge.
Yes.
The executive team by themselves, let alone the rest of the organization. What was your preferred tool for doing that? Was it the cattle prod? What seemed to work to get people on the same page like that? Was there anything, or was it magic?
I don't think it's magic. And I think this is true for any of the organizations I've worked with. It's about communication and it's about trust. And those are two core components that you have to be able to go through and flex it a lot. When people get quiet, they're like my children. It's like, I want to go see in the other room what's going on. I found as a leader that, and I could tell you that I was probably about 40 to 50% away from home because we were a global company. But that factor that I learned, from my lean training was, go to the Gemba, go to where the stuff is being built. And I was addicted to that, to be honest with you. I was like getting on planes because I want to go and see, okay, what's happening in Russia? What's happening over in Germany? What's happening over in Israel? And hopping planes back and forth. And I was surprised at what we would see when we were there. So communication, Zoom, Zoom is great. We didn't have Zoom back then for it. So someone sends me a note on an email that still doesn't give enough contrast. Go there and actually talk to the people who are building the product. You start to hear things that, one makes you incredibly proud of your teams. And then other parts saying, ooh, that sounds tricky, and how can you as a leader in particularly not bias yourself or put in front of yourself just the information that makes you feel good that you're on the right path. So you got to really get out there, including go stop by a customer and get yelled at. One of my first roles as a director, I actually did something that at the time, because Intel was in a mode of we know what the customers want. We know. This is before the big Agile transformation took place. And I found that, no, we didn't. And there was a lot of customers that the reason why they were with us is because, well, in certain cases, we were the only ones who could produce enough product for them. And if given a second opportunity of someone who could also equally produce those chips, then guess what? They would go. So, I think leaders need to get into the field. I think you got to also put your employees out into the field too.
Has that changed with, well, it must have changed with Zoom and all the online tools that we're using these days, or do you think it's still critical for us to be hopping on that plane?
I think at least once it's critical,
Mhm.
but I'm right now in my office is like a mini studio. I've got production lights, I've got, things around me. I have an environment that's created around me. Um, you don't see all of my body language. You get a little bit of it,
Mm.
if I start to animate a little bit, but you don't see, the rest. This is also always on, meaning that I can tell when somebody is engaged or not engaged, depending on what they're doing and how they're acting. But you find that as I'm on, I've got to be present there versus you see somebody sitting down having a cup of coffee someplace, if you're in Germany and sit down and have coffee and talk about their family a little bit, you know. I mean, at least from a leader perspective, I always thought, bring your whole self to work, you know,
Yeah.
don't leave it at the door, you know.
So you and I both have been in the agile business for a little while,
Yeah,
and
it's been a while.
yeah, we've seen
I had
we've
hair back then. No, I'm kidding.
yeah, both of us.
Yeah.
And so we've seen some of the innovations come along
Mhm.
on the strategy front. There have been a few. And I'm wondering, is there anything that you're intrigued by? Anything? And this is our opportunity really to geek out a little bit. I saw Wardley mapping, and I thought that was so cool. I thought that
Yeah.
was so awesome. And what are the things that you find intriguing these days going on in sort of the that domain? What interests you now?
Well, Wardley mapping, yes, but you got to mob it. You got to get enough people in the room to make that really just drive a conversation that just where data is just oozing out every place where you go, oh, we need to go dig down that for a little bit. I think lean value trees, because it does structure itself in the way of being able to say from an ambitious goal or your objective to be able to take that down to what we think, and this is the important thing, what we think the strategy is.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
then from that, then placing those strategic bets in order to get a proof of value back as soon as you can, meaning you set up experimentation in order to kind of drive it through the system, and you fluctuate your bets based upon what gets returned. I think a lot of companies go down diminishing returns a lot. I mean, if you think about just
Yeah.
by shifting the language to bet,
Yeah.
that changes the mindset a little bit on the way that you approach. Um, I think there's a whole bunch of other different models that are linking together with, okay, more of a solutions thinking type of perspective where it's like, well, time to information, but not just time from my interface to the customers, but time through the entire organization. How can we not treat it where we're just throwing things over the wall, which a lot of companies are, and really start to live up to the agile principle of the business working together with development daily, you know.
Mhm. Very cool. Very cool. The and so given all of that, do we, as agilists, do we focus on these new methods? The Wardley mappings. What did you call? I hadn't heard of the other one. The
Lean
uh,
value trees.
lean value trees.
Mhm.
Um, should we be looking there, or is there value in using some of the older tools? The balanced scorecards, the blue ocean strategy, the Porter's five forces, that kind of stuff.
Again, I think all of those models will give us a perspective, a dimension on maybe the problem statement that
Yeah.
we're doing. If I think of balanced scorecards or the fact of just doing strategy mapping over, okay, well, if I'm, take for example, if you are doing the strategy of adopting agile across your entire business, well, what if I look at it at each of these dimensions and then, specifically looking at where is that going to eventually filter out to the value to the organization and be able to map that effectively with a strategy map, I think works really well because a lot of times, and I still see this today, where, well, agile is what those people over there do.
Hmm.
That's not what I do up here in my job as a leader. And what they don't get, I think, is just that simple reality of, if I build a learning organization, and how do I hate to use the word exploit, but how do I exploit all this information that I'm getting?
Hmm.
Don't leave it on the table. Don't leave the money on the table, because the next business idea might be coming from there,
Hmm. So
even though we can't fund it now.
you kind of need a couple of different lenses or a couple of different perspectives in
Mhm.
order to interpret all of that and come up with something that's going to be reasonably holistic. Doing using just one method may not be enough, may leave you blind to some things.
Absolutely. And I think this is where we mix it up a little bit, where it's like, okay, maybe this time I might go do a Wordly map in my strategic long range plan. Maybe I'll have people do a different model.
Right.
Maybe I'll mix those models in order to see what's there. And as any experiment, we would expect to see different dimensions, or we're going to get smarter from it.
Hmm.
That's I think the main goal. And I think out learning your competition is really kind of job one for the executives. How do we know more than our competitors in a particular space? And
Hmm.
that's including on what investments not to make,
Oof.
and as you know, right now, everyone's hiring AI.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like AI, everyone's got to have AI. Ah,
Hmm. Hmm.
hey, go get them. It was no different than when we talked about the Internet of Things.
Yeah.
Everyone, Internet of Things, we're going
Yeah.
to sail the
Yeah.
boat. And investments were shifting. And, I'm sitting back and going, a pencil doesn't need Wi-Fi,
Right. Right.
and there's going to be a point where the bubble pops. And then what's the strategy?
Hmm.
I could tell you one of the projects that I worked on was probably one of the most difficult one that I had to go do. And this is during our Agile adoption work, is what is our strategy for obsolescence? How do we as an organization not fund something for 20 years?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
how do we then, from a marketplace perspective, we've got all these ideas that we want to go do, but you never have enough time or people or resources to go do it. But maybe some of those things that are on the diminishing, long end of the tail,
Hmm.
how do we free them in
Yeah.
order to then move them and shift them left and to go work on these other ideas?
I
And I could tell,
completely agree.
and
Yeah.
I could tell you one of the things I have discovered during that is our hoarding mentality that was
Mhm.
created because of the way that we do our budgets.
Yeah. Mhm.
And so this kind of is the next dimension I think everyone has to go rethink if you're going to really truly get agility in your organization, is go read Beyond Budgeting. Go read some of the books that are talking about new models and how to go do finance within your organizations. Because I literally worked for a general manager one time who says plus or minus 5% on spending. If you're out of bounds of either one of those, you're in my mind not a good manager, a good leader of your organization, because you should be hitting your targets. And I remember having a conversation with one of our vendors who was providing, $1 million oscilloscopes to us. And they're going, hey, we're going to give you a 20% discount because you're a good customer. And I'm going, nope, can't take it. Can't take it, because that would ruin the plus or minus 5% thing. And I literally told him, could you give us more probes? Could you give us, buffer this? And I remember we had boxes of probes sitting on the ground that we never used.
Oh my God, that's great. That's great.
It's crazy stuff, but that type of
Hmm.
behavior, and I'll give you one other example. I actually had another leader who had a really great project, but he needed 5 more engineers to go work on it. And I looked at my POR, my plan of record, and I looked at his, and I said, you know what? I think there's higher value down that road
Hmm.
for what you're working on. Here are the 5 engineers. I got into the next year's annual plan. I lost my 5 people.
Right. Right.
And so the behaviors then just reinforce, let me hoard.
Right. Right.
You know?
Absolutely.
So you got to break down those things, I think, in most of these processes, where I am just the caretaker of this.
Mhm.
I don't own it. And
Right.
I think that's what you got to get people shifted
That's,
out of you know, I can't give you this because if I do, I'm going to get punished somehow.
and maybe that's some of the underlying mechanism that makes a lot of strategy very difficult, because ultimately it is going to change who I control or what I control, those sorts of things.
Yeah.
Uh, and that's ultimately threatening to the folks who are
Well,
involved.
well, let's take the failure model. So how do your companies today deal with failure?
Mhm.
And I remember getting exposed to one business because I'm an addict for talking to people about how they approach things, and I adopted a pattern that they did because I thought it was just cool, and it was the wall of failure. And it was this big wall that I walked into their office, and they had all these stories and narratives put up about how failure happened, and they considered that's how they mined and taught their new people to come in to the organization. That's how they taught them about the culture of the company of being open to failure,
Yeah.
because there were stories on this wall from executives, there were stories on this wall from engineers and others, and it was all about sort of bringing together that knowledge. And some of the stories that were on this wall were, they were amazing. They were an
Mhm.
amazing contrast that you can say that this company is not going to beat me up because I failed.
Mhm. So you're creating that sense of safety around failure that enables us or buffers us, I guess, to a certain degree culturally, to allow us to start having maybe more fruitful strategic conversations.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
And I think that's I mean, how many strategic long range plans does it open the opening of these meetings that you have in your executives today start to say, what did we fail at last year?
Right,
What
right.
did we learn? And
Mhm.
I think, and I take the word failure out and just say, what did we learn last year? And then the next part of that, and this is the other thing, is if I'm releasing things in 2 week cadences, isn't it a bit crazy to have a 1 year planning cycle before I can come back to the bank?
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, and all of that seems to, you know, dovetail well with fostering a culture of that continuous learning, and evolving strategy. So maybe that's the other question here. Um, when we think about strategy, I'm very accustomed to strategy as an annual conversation and as a multi-year conversation, the big conversation. But of course, in my agile world, I live in a world of 2 week sprints, of much shorter time frames. Does strategy need to be something that we talk about more frequently?
I think the answer is yes. And specifically, if you take like lean startup techniques or other things where you have tripwires that you build into your planning, which is if we trip that wire for whatever reason, that's a trigger for a conversation.
Hmm.
And so that could happen as an asynchronous cycle. Putting on my CPU head, I think we have a very healthy synchronous cycle in most companies. I think we have a very unhealthy asynchronous cycle. And if I think about interrupts when they occur, people's reaction to an interrupt is like, oh, there's an interrupt. Oh, versus, hey, that's something we should pay attention to and have that conversation about what is the potential remedy, or let's monitor it closer. It's sort of let's we now have a tag that's been put on that because that interrupt occurred. And maybe we won't change the investment yet, but you're now on my monitor list. And when I think about metrics that management looks at daily, that's the new thing that gets inserted into your metrics package that goes, oh, I need to closely monitor that thing. We used to have tiger teams to go handle big problems. Anyone else here have tiger teams? I'm not sure what we called it that, because there was no tigers. But but they were very effective and fast at resolving issues. And I've always wondered why senior management felt that they didn't need to follow similar patterns all the time, having tiger teams all the time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, and in fact, I've heard of a lot of tiger teams, but I don't think I've actually ever used one. I don't think. I mean, I've had teams that might have been considered. I don't think so.
Have you ever had a Guyet meeting?
No, what's that?
Get your act together meeting. We used to have those.
And so was that your project is out of control, your project is in trouble, or
Yeah, and you get to form a Guyet.
nice,
And
nice.
it typically one of the senior leaders, senior executives would be running the meeting,
Uh-huh.
which
Uh-huh.
is which again, that's connecting to,
Yeah,
going to the Gemba and being, if
exactly.
you it's a Kaizen event in most regards.
Yeah, yeah, that's actually really cool. I love that. Yeah. So when you talk about these teams, of course, I'm used to, your typical agile, empowered, self-organizing team. In some ways, that that seems to conflict a bit with this notion of having an organizational strategy and placing these bets, because a lot of the agile self-organizing teams, boy, they tend to be pretty inwardly focused. They have their own agenda, they have their own product, they have their own thing. How do we bring them on board, or how do we keep them in tune with all of this? Because to be honest with you, I've struggled with that. I've had a hard time sometimes getting teams on board.
Well, I think there's kind of two factors. Number one, the reason why we create an organizational structure is to drive focus around something. So when we organize a group of people together, we want to have those people working on that particular item. The question is, and I was at a fast event. It's one I forget the gentleman who's inventing fast, but it's a new way of getting a group of people and using open space technology
Yeah.
things
Like,
together for it, and it looked really cool. Yeah, that's
mhm.
right.
Yeah.
And and the first thing that I was thinking about is how do you not get distracted by other people's noise?
Hmm.
And so, we were one of the first organizations in Intel to put in team rooms, and the reason for it was is we didn't want to hear everyone else's noises,
Right.
so that there can be focus. I think though that there then has to be, and I think this is how the business update meetings shift. I think business update meetings should be a little bit less of my executive standing up there, a little bit more of demos of what the other cool stuff that the group did. It needs to be like a county fair where you're going
Hmm.
from
Yeah.
booth to booth to booth,
Yep.
going, it's the greatest pan ever. Well,
Hmm.
I didn't even know I needed this pan, but this is great. I think there needs to be more of that energy that we see in the way that we go deliver stuff. And I don't know if this is your experience, but this has been mine. And that's the fully going up the stack of people to eventually getting to where, if I had to go talk about Agile, are they speaking the language? Are they getting that part?
Hmm.
And I think some of our frameworks, unfortunately, are just kind of flipping the phase gate cycles, and it looks phase
Hmm.
gate from the top and it looks agile at the bottom.
Yep.
Question is how can we truly get a structure through an organization? And again, I'll put my problem that I had, which was we're a 120,000 person company. How do you focus that much information? How do you how do you compile that up to where it makes sense? Or, in even though the methods worked, I think there was a lot of inefficiency in the process.
Hmm.
I mean, literally taking weeks to get information up to the top.
Yeah, that's when you get to that scale, it really starts to look daunting. Yeah.
And when I used to be in a position where I would get Michael Dell would call Paul Otellini, and Paul Otellini would skip 5 levels and come down to me and say, Ray, what the
Hmm.
beep is going on with this? And so that there are some ad hoc processes that people know who to go talk to within it. But so, and I think this is your question about who's the role of the knowledge broker within the organization, and how can we make that easier to go transcend and go look at. If you've got a small company, that's not as hard.
Right, right.
But how do you do that in a way that makes it relevant to what I'm working on?
Yeah.
You know.
No, that makes sense. That makes and I just got off the phone with a client today that was having a very similar problem, which is they had a limited number of folks, the knowledge brokers, the folks who could be trusted to answer the question, and yet they had this layer of product owners and others who were supposed to be the ones to communicate that information, but they didn't have the same level of knowledge as the broker. So how do we get all of this aligned? How do we keep these people in these roles in a way where they can communicate this information, where this broker can get this information out in an effective fashion? And it was not an easy question to answer.
Yeah, or just even identifying who those people are. It becomes several phone calls before you know it. I mean, the agile teams that we had that used to work for me back at Intel, we had call lists. We knew that if there's something in that particular unit, that's that product owner. They are the decision maker for that. So therefore, they should be knowledgeable if you were to ask them a question about where something was at or where things are, they could answer that question. And that was put into the roles and responsibilities of that role. Now, keep in mind when it got bigger, when we are delivering like 26 components that needed to come together on the platform, then we actually needed a small product owner office so that if I called the product owner office, there was somebody within that group of people who could answer that question. So we
Mhm.
had very direct places we can go to, and we didn't have to go learn it off the street, or even worst case, the scenario where, you know, Michael Dell calls Paul Otellini and then calls me. We need that stuff to go away.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so I've noticed there are a couple of questions here about some of the things we've covered. Um, the
Sure.
One person wanted to know a little bit more about the impact of budgeting on strategy and on change. And I think this was where you were talking about beyond budgeting,
Yeah.
which I love. And one of the things that I just love about that is that it's all about taking what is one of the more constraining processes that budgeting and finance operations within the organization, and turning it into something that becomes more of a ghost in the machine, more
Mhm.
of a less of a constraint and more of an enabler in the organization, where the bank is open all the time, we can get what we need, and we can find the information we need to operate without having to be told what to do next.
Well, I think that again, when you're talking about agile and agile organizations, I think that finance needs to be included in there, number one.
Huge.
I can really tell you that, and I remember having this conversation with, one of my finance people a long time ago. And excuse, I won't cuss the same way as this, but I had a finance person telling me, no, you can't go fund this particular project.
Mhm, mhm,
And I asked the question, do we have the money sitting there to go do this if we choose to reprioritize?
yeah,
Yes, but you can't because blah, 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 blah.
mhm,
And I remember telling the person that you're my fracking bank. Tell me whether or not we have the dollars. And if you do, then we are going to go shift those dollars around. And I just found it was an adversarial conversation versus they seem to be at the other side of the table,
mhm,
you know. And I actually pointed to our legal group as saying, this is how I need you guys to model yourselves. Because
mhm.
our legal group would always, if you go to them and say, I have a question on this, and they would always say, thank you for coming and talking to us about this.
Yeah. And I do think that one of the things for the longest time, finance was really one of the only controls, the only metrics an organization
Yeah.
had. It was the only tool. Everything, everything was a nail. You had a hammer. That was it.
Yes.
And the thing that's interesting now is that in this richer world that I think we're evolving into, we have many more tools at our disposal in terms of customer feedback, in terms of customer relationships and things like that, that give us a much richer set of information to work with, so that we're not exclusively reliant on finance to control the organization for us to make those key decisions.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's important to understand, well, what is my balance sheet? What am, if
So
you think it's critical in order to make investments that you know what you can do.
yeah.
And again, back to lean value trees, if you go look at part of the way methodology is if those points of value aren't coming back, there's processes in place where you say, look, I'm going to cut this budget by 30%. I'm not going to cut it to the bone in the very beginning, but I'm going to cut back because it doesn't look like it's going to bear fruit. And then that frees those resources and people and dollars and everything else to start to go over and fund something else or fund a new experiment.
Mm-hmm.
And talk about it at the, at least at the every month mark or every quarterly mark, you should be having these meaningful discussions about where those are bearing. Don't make them too tight, because one data point doesn't make a trend. So you got to really go look at and say, well, what other data points am I going to collect around the problem space in
Yeah.
order to be able to work? Did
I
I
love
answer the finance question, by the way?
I'm
I,
not
I, I kind of meandered.
sure. Well, I for one, let's see. Pamela has a comment here. I think that orgs where finance rules the roost, it's because earlier leadership failures where finance was the backstop. Once finance is controlled, then the ideas of discovery, value, and opportunity disappear. Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, somebody a long time ago told me that you're going to have like three different types of CEOs in your life. You're going to have the founder, who's the innovator, the one who's not caring about the finances. They're off just going out and doing cool things.
Uh-huh.
The next person that takes up the reins is typically and no offense to anyone if they are in the finance circle, the bean counter, the one who's going to
Yeah.
drive optimization within the organization and start to bring down costs and get things in alignment. And then the last one is your lawyer, who's going to be selling parts of you off because of your IP is now worth more than actually you producing it yourself. And I think what we see in these trends is that, and this happened at Intel.
Ooh.
The Paul Otellini came from the finance circle. And so we started to behave like a finance company.
Yeah.
So I think the CEO of the organization needs to really be able to, I think they need to rotate a bit.
Yeah.
If they're birthed internally,
Mm-hmm.
you got to work them around the organization so that they can have more than just the one kind of view to it.
Well, I've loved this conversation. I want to check in with folks. This has been fantastic. Are there any?
Everyone raise your hand if you liked it. I see no hands.
All right.
There we go. Hey.
There we go.
Awesome.
Excellent. All right. That's fabulous. Um, so thank you again, Ray. You, as always, are just delightful to talk with. And folks, Ray Arell, one of my favorite Agile people. So if you're looking for someone to help you on an engagement, I couldn't recommend anyone better.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. So you can go over to nuagility.com, nuagility.com. That's my company. Also, I do a podcast. It's called the Agile Coaching Network. It comes out monthly. You can see those if you follow me on LinkedIn. That's typically where I market that through. But it's a group of Agilists who get together, as well as a few hundred of our closest friends. We get together monthly and do a recording session. You can also attend those recording sessions if you want to. We talk about these types of subjects. So welcome to join me in that.
Awesome. Thank you again. And Sherry Ann, I'll hand it back to you at this point. I think it's a wrap.